Hello. Looks like everybody's coming online. Thank you all for being here. Hello, welcome to our panel discussion on Russell Hoban's 1980 novel, Riddley Walker. I'm Diana Slickman. I'll be the host and moderator of the discussion, and I am joined by my friend and co-host, Dave All. I'm going to get to a few pieces of housekeeping business as everybody gets settled and in the room with us. Just first thing you should know is that this event is being recorded. You'll be able to access it later on russellhoban.org. We'll send out a link when that's available. I'd encourage you to join us. This is a chat-only participation event, so you're muted and your video's disabled, but we're glad you're here and we are excited to have your questions. So if you have any questions to post, put them in the chat. Tell us where you're calling from. We'd love to know where in the world we're getting our audience. So some of you we know, some of you we don't, which is very exciting. For those of you who are new or less familiar with Zoom, there are a couple of things that you should know. Your chat button should be down at the bottom of the screen, and you can click on that and reveal the chat and add things to that. There's also a button that says View, and you can change the view from the gallery view, which is just what it sounds like, pictures in a gallery, everybody visible. Or you can change it to speaker view, which will show just the person who's speaking in the foreground and other people off to the side or up at the top. Or you can change it to something called multi-speaker view, which looks like it has the two most recent the person who's talking in the most recent speaker on the foreground. So that's up to you, depending on what how much visual input you want. What else can I tell you? We'll be taking questions later, so definitely let us know what questions you have about the text, about basically anything. This event is, another thing about the chat. If things get crazy, if there's just a lot of activity in the chat, we may have to pause it for a minute to give Dave a chance to catch up and synthesize the questions that are that are coming through. So don't be alarmed if you see that you can't post for a minute or two. We'll probably turn that off and back on as necessary. This event is one of, we hope, many this year that are celebrating the centenary of Russell Hoban's birth. And it's organized by russellhoban.org and is free of charge. But if you feel like donating a little something toward helping make this event and other events possible, you can do so by going to russellhoban.org and clicking on the orange button that says Support Me on Ko-fi. That's Ko-fi, which looks like coffee or Ko-fi or a number of other things, but we're told it's pronounced Ko-fi. So that's that. Pull this piece of paper away. The first order of business is we want to introduce our panelists, who we're very excited to have with us. Wieland Hoban is a composer and a translator who's currently working on a music theater adaptation of Riddley Walker, and as you may have surmised, is one of Russell Hoban's sons. Wieland, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Just to give everybody a point of reference, Wieland is joining us from Frankfurt. So this adds to the international character of our event. Eli Bishop is the creator and maintainer of the Riddley Walker Annotations website, as well as being a current member of the San Francisco Neo-Futurists. He's also the author and illustrator of several microcomics. I'm sorry to say that he is not the Eli Bishop who holds the world record for fastest hand clapping, but we are happy to have him here just the same. Eli, welcome.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't think of getting him, but I could have tried.
And Dr. Kate Laity is an author, scholar, filmmaker, and arcane artist who teaches medieval literature, film, gender studies, digital humanities, and popular culture. And Kate is joining us from Hudson, New York. So welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Again, I'm Diana Slickman. For those of you in the know, I'm the S in the SA4QE annual Russell Hoban birthday celebration event. And my co-host is Dave All, who is the founder of the Russell Hoban online community, as well as the creator of the original Russell Hoban website, the head of Orpheus. One of the first things I'd like to hear from our panelists is when did you first read Riddley Walker, and what were your first impressions of the book? What made you a fan? And I think a good place to start would be with Wieland, because obviously he was on site, but really just a child when the book was published, about 2 years old, I think, Wieland. When did the book first swim into your consciousness?
I think as far as just general awareness of things happening around me goes, it would have been when the stage adaptation was put on in Manchester at the Royal Exchange in '86, because well, Dad went there and took us along. You know, we went as a family to one of the performances, and I just have very, very vague recollection of, you know, David Threlfall and the others sort of in rags talking about I don't know, sort of dirt and animal dung, and also remembering the sight of the blinded Ardship of Cambrai. Yeah, so but it was a few years later that I took on the book. I guess I was about 13. That would have been in '91. And it, you know, it instantly spoke to me, actually. And, you know, I imagine we'll be saying a few things later about the language, but I think I probably found the language less hard than some people seem to, because to me, you know, if you read it out loud, and especially also if you have an English rather than an American accent, I think also it's you see the puns more obviously. And yeah, I mean, I want to give the others enough chance to respond, but that was when it first grabbed me, you know, and over the years I've reread it a few times. But just after reading it that first time, I felt like, you know, there was something there that was just too much to absorb all at once, but it had just instinctively grabbed me and stayed with me.
Yeah, I think that may be a common experience for a lot of people, that it hits you all at once and stays with you for a long time. Eli, I've heard you say that you were about 12 years old 12 or 13 when you first encountered the book.
I'm fairly sure I was 12, because which would have put it in 1985, because the first thing he says in the book is that he's just turned 12, and I was like, I'm 12. And which might be a bit young, I don't know, to read this. I was very taken with it right away. I mean, at the time I would pick up anything that looked like science fiction, and I wasn't real sure about whether this was based on the cover, but I got far enough into it to realize that it would qualify, and so I would go for it. And I think I was also pretty taken with the language right away. I found it a little difficult, probably less so for that aspect, because I don't know, I think I was expecting it to be weird and so on. I was reading it through that a filter of feeling like that was a cool thing about it. The things that were over my head were everything else. But, anyway, yeah, I think I also didn't realize at the time, I think, that I had read his children's books. And I think for a lot of people, they don't like that's the same guy. I figured that out a bit later.
Yeah. I think, yeah, like you say, I think that's a lot of people are like, there's a little bit of dissonance there that, you know, the author of some of these beloved children's books is also this deep thinking adult author. So, Kate, what about you? What's your first experience with the book?
I'm not sure exactly the first experience. I know I read it in the 80s, I think when I was living in California. And because someone had recommended it to me because I said I loved the language of A Clockwork Orange, which a book I'd read in high school, and taught me the importance of looking for the apparatus in the back of a book, because I read the whole book before I realized there was a glossary in the back, which certainly helps. And I genuinely don't remember anything about the first reading of it, other than I just kind of, once I started it, I didn't stop until I finished it. So it has this kind of sort of fever dream aspect to it. But what really sticks with me is when I reread it after I was in grad school in Connecticut and studying medieval literature and Old English and Middle English. And it had just a lasting impact because of that, because of the way it uses languages, but also the way it uses medievalism in very interesting ways. And of course, the legend of St. Eustace, which of course by then I had read saints' legends too. And so the whole idea of how those are ways of storytelling that carry a great deal of weight made the book work in a totally different way for me that really stuck with me. And then I was like, oh, I've got to write about this somehow. So I ended up writing a piece about medievalism in the novel for Puppetry magazine, which is interesting too. But it's interesting, sort of all of the things that end up being in that book that I think only after a long time did I sort of sort out how many things stayed with me. And I'm like, even kind of weird things like my partner is a walker. It sort of didn't occur to me until somewhat later, going, wait a minute. It was like, is that fate, or, you know, or even becoming a medievalist? Because I certainly didn't know anything about medieval literature when I read it the first time. You know, I didn't think of medieval literature at all. And so it's a totally different reading with all of that behind it. And it really has stuck with me in a different way because of that, and because of all the things that I see it and other interests that, again, it's like which came first, the interests or reading the book, and it just sort of planted these ideas that exploded later. And I realized too, when I'm rereading it this weekend, that in the notes at the back of, because I'm reading the expanded edition, that there's just a single line where he mentions the descent of Inanna, and I'm like, I forgot he ever mentioned that. And it's like, that's always been a very important story to me that I've also taught many times in classes. And in fact, I taught Riddley Walker the last semester I was at my first academic job in Texas. We arranged to take students to Britain, and I made sure that we included a trip to Canterbury, because I'd never been to Canterbury, and I was like teaching Riddley Walker to people so that I could like, I have a bunch of people who will be interested about going to Canterbury. Well, we read Marlowe too, and Chaucer and things like that. So a variety of things, but we went so I could finally go to Canterbury Cathedral and see Yusa. And again, just sort of the weird fever dream part of it is that we went to the cathedral And in the afternoon, I came down with this terrible fever. In fact, they were thinking they were going to have to take me to a hospital and leave me behind. But I finally, I woke up the next day and it was gone. But it was really weird, just sort of, it feels like one of these weird shamanic experiences where it's like you see the image and you fall into sickness until you can sort of be absorbed somehow. So that's my weird stories around Ridley.
That's amazing. Yeah. I've, I think Eli and I share this experience where I can't exactly remember how I came across the book. I feel like I can see it on the shelves of a room in my childhood home, and I'm not sure how it would have gotten there. Certainly my father wouldn't have read it, but my mom might have, and it might have been something given to her by who knows who, but I probably read it in college, and it's one of those books that I think that if you read the first paragraph and you can't not read the second paragraph, it's your book. And if you read the first paragraph and go, what the, it's not your book. So, and it was that book for me, it was my book. And I think also, like Eli, a lot of it went right past me. Some of the story spoke to me as, it's a hero's journey in a lot of ways. So it's got that narrative through line, but a lot of the larger issues were lost on me. But subsequent readings and hopefully increased maturity has made the book a richer experience for me. And I think that's probably true of a lot of it. It bears repeat readings, I think. So
Definitely.
Wieland,
But by the way,
ahead,
I'm
Mike.
sorry, I'm quite
Okay.
sure it was my mom. I know the
yeah.
book on the shelf. I'm fairly sure she got it. That's also how I found out it's Stephen King. She's in the chat now. Hello.
Hi, Mom. Yeah, it's one of those things. Wieland, I'm interested in the work of adapting the book to the stage. I know it's had the stage adaptation that you spoke of before. I believe there's been a puppet version of the book as well. But I'm interested in what music will bring to the story, and where I imagine there are numerous challenges in bringing the story to the stage. And I'm interested to hear what you're finding.
Well, my first decision, since I knew that there was a stage adaptation which he himself had made, my first decision was that I would use that rather than, trying to come up with some sort of version of the novel. And it was rather interesting to read it because, it's not published for one thing, and I had to go via quite an indirect route with actually a lot of, I guess, sort of good luck, in order to get a copy of the script via actually the puppet folks in Waterford in Ireland who had put on a production of it. And in any case, the script is a somewhat different beast to the book, actually, which is also interesting. For example, it makes sense when you consider that it's theater, but the premise is actually that of a performance, as opposed to just, the narrator telling his story. And so something that you only get at the end of the novel, which is Ridley, doing his own show, becoming a performer in his own right, that's something that's actually the starting point in the play. So he's calling everyone, Riddley Walker show, rather than use a show. And so then from that's like the frame story, and I guess there's a kind of back and forth between the story that's being performed and the things that happen during that performance. And I was also, of course, thinking about how to deal with the speech, because, I mean, the music I write, you would say it's like modernist art music or avant-garde. And so, you know, there are any number of possible ways to approach, you know, vocal sounds, vocal techniques, whether it's, you know, singing with clearly identifiable pitches or using some different degrees of noise, or maybe a more recited speech-like approach. And so I was thinking quite a lot about that, and it was fairly clear to me that, you know, with that sort of style, it would be mildly absurd to have, you know, a real kind of sung score in, you know, in some sort of operatic way. You know, I'm not really a fan of opera at the best of times, and it was clear that it would be much more spoken, and that maybe for certain situations, and actually they come in the form of some these dreamlike sequences featuring these female figures, which well, there's Auntie, but also Auntie has this kind of mystical double who is in the book only mentioned as a kind of symbol, her who has her womb at Cambrai. But in the play appears in a couple of mysterious interludes as a kind of, I don't know, night goddess or something. And so those sorts of episodes, it seemed to make sense to have some more, you know, melodic cantabile kind of singing. But for the rest of it, you know, to retain some of that gruffness, it would have to be something more spoken. I mean, rhythmically and sometimes less rhythmically, but generally spoken. And also the sound world, I also realized early on would have to be something quite rough sounding. So for example, I mean, let's say using a kind of medium-sized ensemble of, you know, mixture of different instruments, that, for example, the percussion, it wouldn't be, you know, xylophones and timpani. It would be more like, you know, pieces of glass and rock and wood, you know, or sort of makeshift noisy chimes that would be sort of shaken, things that connect to also the physical world around them, which is a kind of scrapyard and you know, rock and water world. I mean,
yeah,
it's
raining all the time, isn't it? In the whole
it
story,
is,
which it makes and you think of people walking through that, there's a real soundscape that accompanies the action, I think.
yeah. I mean, I guess something like that. I decided to leave out this idea of a backdrop, but one idea that did come later on for a kind of prelude or sort of short overture, which I in jest renamed underture, is a sort of sound of some crackling fire, because that kind of relates, I guess, to the charcoal burners and the way that fire in its other forms also, you know, in the sense of explosion, gunpowder, this whole idea of the quest, you know, the quest for gunpowder and you know, sulfur, saltpeter, all this, that's could be a kind of theme. But I should add that, you know, there's all this thinking that's been going into it, and also conversations with with partners who are interested in working on it, but I haven't actually really written any of it apart from this underture, which is a slightly amorphous sort of thing, which is more about a choreography of certain actions that lead to a sort of building of makeshift instruments and playing on them, as opposed to real notated pitches and rhythms.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. I think that'll be really interesting. Do you have a production date? Do you know when and where it will be performed, or is it all just in the planning,
Nope.
writing right now?
Yeah, that's still, I mean, you know, music theater, it's compared to, say, a string quartet, it's just pretty complex to organize in terms of, you know, finding collaborators and finding a place. And I've also been thinking about different approaches to the venue. For example, having it open air with, say, a modular stage that you can create a certain different sorts of shapes where maybe you could have then audience placed at different parts of it so that the action is in the middle of the audience. I guess nowadays one calls that a kind of immersive thing.
Yeah.
Though it's not,
Which
piece
seems
wouldn't
really
be.
appropriate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I
know.
mean, considering the ending too.
Yeah, I know. To me, the word immersive suggests something a bit trance-like, which is definitely not what the sound world would be like. So there was that idea. Then there's also the idea of you know, as a warehouse, and actually in Canterbury there is a disused apartment store that that we've been thinking about looking into as a space. Yeah, there are these things haven't been decided yet.
Yeah. Early days. Yeah. Oh, it sounds great. It's really interesting. Eli, I want to turn to you now and talk a little bit about the annotations website. I have a feeling I know how you might have gotten started doing that, but I want to hear you talk about it.
Yeah, I had to refresh my memory by digging up some very old email. So as some people here will know, Diana and Dave and I and other people in the chat who are talking about the Kraken are talking about an email list discussion group that Dave put together starting in I think 1999 because he had started a website about Russ's work. It's kind of early-ish internet days, so you're not going to find a website about everything. And so anyone who was interested was very happy to see that right away. And so some of them contacted him. He got back to us, said, let's do a mailing list. So there was lively discussion going on for right from the start about everybody's favorite books, and people certainly had a lot of their own origin stories of Riddley Walker and encountering it and so on. And then it was in 2001, another commenter on the list who then kind of dropped out of sight. Maybe she's out there. If you're here, hello. She had come on saying, you know, I did a project for an undergraduate thing that was included like writing a lot of annotations about Riddley Walker. Maybe I could put them online or something. And everyone agreed that that sounded fantastic. Again, this was a time in the online world where if you had something that you felt was a niche interest and then you found a website about it, you'd be very happy. So anyway, then nothing was said of it for a few more months, and then at the end of 2001, I was desperately casting about for something to do, and hanging out on the list quite a bit, and brought it back up, said, shall we do this? Would you like to send me the material and I'll help with the website? And then that didn't happen because, as I said, the other commenter just fell off of the list, and I never got to see what she had done. So it's never too late. But anyway, other people were like, yeah, let's do this. Started chipping in with some suggestions of their own. And so the first version of the actual website was at like the end of 2001. And that was maybe about 2/3 of what's on there now. I half. I'm not sure. It's just been rewritten and extended a lot over the years. What would happen usually is some new person would come on the list, get very excited, and or they would just search on the website and get excited. And either way, they'd suddenly have a lot of ideas, and so it would just sort of get extended a bit at a time. And also, I'm not a web designer, so I would periodically just change my mind about how it should all be put together.
Yeah.
No, Graham asks whether I'm talking about Alida Allison, the late great Alida Allison. No, she did contribute to the discussion for sure, and also another great academic source was Barbara Becker from UC San Diego. I think that was like a couple years after the site had been created. Barbara contacted me and had done also in her teaching, done a lot of cool reference material for this. So anyway, no, the only reason I wasn't mentioning the original commenter's name is just because there was a lot of us just having in an email group. I don't know if it's a faux pas to just drop random people's names in, but anyway, yeah, I was actually, I couldn't remember, Diana, I knew this question would come up, and I was like, was this even my idea? Well, not really, but yeah, it's at a certain point, I also kind of just decided to more or less freeze it. People still email me now and then, and I'll make fixes or whatever, but it was more like first 4 or 5 years when it was being put together.
It's a terrific resource, and if anybody here has not found it yet, we'll post the link to it in the chat. It really helps deepen your appreciation of what's being done, not only with the language of the book, but it helps with things like geographical references. It helps with just just all kinds of, someone who's not a native of Britain, there are a lot of references that we just naturally don't have as American readers, and it really helps to have those things explained a little bit. I see Richard's posted that in the chat, so I can't recommend it enough. Kate, you talked a little bit about how your work has overlapped with Riddley Walker. I'm interested in the medievalism aspect of it. How do you feel like it speaks to that time, how Riddley Walker speaks to that time frame, or where there are, if there are stylistic things or storytelling mechanisms that are similar to that literature?
I mean, the big thing, of course, is the image of Yusuf from the cathedral and the wall painting that had been there. The ways that, people tend to think of the Middle Ages as the church controlled everything. Most people went to church once a year. They went for Easter, they went to confess their sins, and that was pretty much it. But where most of their knowledge of Christianity came from, I mean, for the average person who is not literate, it was wall paintings and it was the performance of the mystery plays. So both of these items really, they play a role in the novel. Yusa, of course, because what's left of the image, which even now, if you go there, there's a reconstructive version, which I think is they say in the notes too. But there's the original wall painting, which was greatly worn away, and then there's a reconstruction of it. I think it's opposite it. I'm trying to remember. So you can kind of see it. But again, even for a modern audience, that's difficult because it's all of these pieces of the story sort of in together. We're used to like one image telling one story. So we're not used to the kind of, it's like similar to comics where we have a kind of narrative that rolls out, but it's all in one image. So reading it, from the bottom to the top, if I remember correctly, you have to understand sort of how those different images that are all sort of smashed together are read in a narrative. But also the idea of the mystery plays and how that is an image of how the stories are are brought to life. So that's the image people would have had of this religion that they supposedly followed, was very much a constructed one that, you know, we have a very, sorry, I have a tendency to start and then jump to something and then jump to something else. But the difference between the view literate people had of religion, and again, this is where the texts that we have from that time, which are all very complicated and are all very detailed, and all these, you know, very deep discussions of doctrine, that's not what the average person would have experienced in terms of religion. They would remember, like on the Corpus Christi plays that were, you know, performed in June because it was the one chance you might hope that the weather was good enough, that because they were performed outside, and people would have had these plays put on by their neighbors, so by people that they knew, but taking up these roles, and in plays that were performed, you know, over and over and over, so people were familiar with them. And again, it's really the same sort of role we could see as the use of puppets, whereas it's giving the orthodoxy. It's telling people, here is what you should believe, and which is why at the beginning of the novel there's a disruption, because suddenly they decide to change the use of story, and people are like, wait a minute, that's not the way the story goes. And they try to cope with that because they're trying to manipulate the culture. And then, of course, at the end of the book, when it's like, well, we have a story and it's in the format that you're familiar with, the puppet show, but it's not the use of story. And again, the wonderful sort of violence that breaks out in the audience, because one guy's like, you know, you can't eat that baby, Mr. Punch, and actually stops the show, which is really funny. But it's also like, it's a literalization of this attempt to control the narrative that is really, again, sort of in my mind, harkens back to this idea of medievalism. But again, sort of how we portray the medieval and the modern has a lot more to say about the modern. You know, again, all of the, you can easily look online for many, many lists of the 10 most misunderstood things about the Middle Ages, and all the things people think no one bathed, and people think, you know, the church controlled everything. And these, of course, are not true, but we have our ideas about the Middle Ages that are very much formed by views from popular culture that are based on, you know, nothing factual. But again, why I never thought I would end up a medievalist is because what I thought of the Middle Ages was something that totally did not interest me. And then I happened to read Beowulf and some Icelandic sagas, and I was like, wait a minute, this is nothing like what I was told. And again, the stories are what sort of change your mind. The stories are what tell you.
Yeah, I one of the things I really love about the end of the last, you know, 10th of the book is that they really can't say Trevenant. It's not, it's going to be, we're trying to change the story of our culture, and you're not going to like it. You know,
but also that it's, I mean, I see in some ways that it's you know, I hate to think of this sort of upward curve of, but it's a definite change, not only in changing the narrative, but it's also asking for participation. Right. I mean, we have sort of involuntary participation when someone tries to stop Mr. Punch, but it's also like the traditional Punch and Judy show, the audience is involved. They're not just passively getting the retelling of the use of story. They're part of it. They're part of the story. And so there's more of that sense of being involved in what's happening too. That it's like, okay, make sure, tell me if he tries to do anything with the baby, and I'm going to go down and, you know, cook my sausages. Yeah,
it changes the dynamic between the receivers of the orthodoxy and the tellers of the orthodoxy. Yeah. Hey, Dave, do you have some questions from the audience that we can have the panel address?
Yeah, we have several here. So I'm gonna, there was one that we got that was actually submitted in advance by Chris Bell in New Zealand, who's with us here.
Hi, Chris.
And he wrote, in Will Self's introduction to Bloomsbury's 20th anniversary edition of Riddley Walker, Will Self cites Hash and Rizlas as the only thing or product that's mentioned by its right name in the novel. And then Chris says there are what I consider to be one or two close run things, such as News of 10 in a chapter 2 rhyme, noting that for a time News at 10 was a nightly feature of British television in the 1960s onwards, a news bulletin on the ITV channels at 10 p.m. But there may be others. So Chris is wondering if there are any other examples, I guess, of things that are told by their right name in the book. That I'll just throw out the thing that occurs to me, having just reread it, is we hear that Riddley Walker, he makes it clear that he knows the difference between the current names and the old names for things. He mentions that Cambry used to be Canterbury, for example. So that's the one that occurs to me.
And I'll throw out too, the thing that I was struck by is the highway names.
Yes.
Yeah, and which makes sense because there are plenty of street and road names all over the world that refer to things that are no longer there, or that don't make sense anymore. So, but we still use them. So,
just to take up the Hash and Rizla reference, that reminds me of a scathing review of the book. Let me see, did I read the review itself, or was it quoted in some essay? But yeah, some critic had sort of lashed the book a bit, because saying that Hash and Rizlas have survived, yet everything else has been destroyed. How is anyone supposed to believe that? And it does stand out slightly as this thing that because it isn't all that. I mean, obviously the act of sort of smoking forms of vegetation is very old, but by sort of fixing it to this historical period closer to the readership than to Ridley, it seems slightly anachronistic.
yeah, and
Peter,
I was thinking about that too. Sorry to jump in, but I was thinking about that too, as in my mind, they are what Rizlas are. And then I thought, well, no, of course they're not. Whatever paper making they have in Ridley's time, it's not going to be the beautiful little white rectangles in the beautiful little package. And my suspicion is that the word was so fun that he couldn't resist it. Rizlas is such a great word, and evocative, and everybody knows what they are, that it was hard to resist. But that's me projecting my sense of things onto the use of the word. So
yeah, and I would say that I think that. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, Peter Christian is saying in the chat much the same thing. He says, we don't know that Ridley's Rizla is the same as ours. Ridley denotes a function in Riddley Walker. We're not told how they're made.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think, Kate probably would be more likely to have actual examples of this, because my mind is now a blank. But I think it's not that unusual for there to be some sort of thing that was a proper noun, a person's name, a place name, whatever, associated with a type of thing, and then at some point later that's been completely forgotten, but it's just entered the language. I think the book doesn't do very much of that, really, compared to a lot of speculative fiction. It's kind of it's a pretty familiar device to drop in these little things like, oh, they named something after the Beatles or whatever, and for the reader's benefit, and that can get a bit old. And I think Rizla might be the only thing he did that was really that specific thing. As far as other things that whose names survived, I think actually London is mentioned once, just in a rhyme as a thing that doesn't exist anymore. But I had forgotten all about the highways. Thank you, Diana.
Yeah, there are a couple of things, a couple people's names too, that are punning, but also relics of the earlier culture. There is a guy named Ender Easton, which I think is very funny if you know anything about EastEnders, and Belgrave Motors. You know, I love that someone is named Belgrave Motors, and I'm sure that person had siblings that were different other kinds of motors, but you know, there is that kind of that sort of trickle down from the earlier culture that survive, which makes sense that it survives in names, because that happens. You know, there are people named Wright, and we don't have many actual Wrights anymore. You know, people who are making wheels, or, you know, whatever.
It was Skyway Motors, as Sean.
Oh, is it Skyway Motors?
Rightly points out in the chat. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. He's one of the heavies.
Yeah, and yeah, Skyway is Belgrave's brother, I think. Is it Belgrave, or am I just making that up?
There is no Belgrave.
Oh, never mind.
As far as I recall.
Yeah, that's my memory. David, anybody else, any other questions from the chat of people here?
Yes, definitely. So Bill Pheasant was wondering, is there anything about the master changes as to why it was 1997? Far enough in the future, but not too far. So I think that's just a general question about the time frame of the story. You know, maybe it's interesting, you know, science fiction writers, they often have to pick a date in the future that they're going to write about.
Well,
like,
didn't he finish writing it in 1979? So maybe just swapping those two digits.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that?
Just very generally, it's again a fairly common thing if you are writing a speculative novel and you want to say it's a little something happened a bit in the future. I mean, it's kind of anybody's guess. I think actually, I don't think it's very clear that 1997 is the date of any big event. It's just the latest date that Good Parley knows about. They saw on some ruins. So
Yeah, on one of the
what they
machines.
find could be quite random, but
You end up doing weird things when you're writing a book. I wrote a book where all the characters' names were taken from roles played by Ned Sparks, who's a character actor in the early 20th century. Just because I had to come up with a bunch of names more than I usually like to do, and it just made it an easier process. So, you know, sometimes there's no one's gonna ever figure the process behind that out.
Yeah.
Unless they're a big, you know, Ned Sparks fan, I guess.
Can I throw
Aaron?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dave.
I was going to say, Erin Farley wrote a question here. She said she was loving the soundscape discussion so much, so many thoughts about sound while reading the book. And I'm wondering, entirely hypothetically, what are the tunes to the songs in Ridley's world? Are they things we could almost recognize as tunes we now know, but broken down and rebuilt in the same way as the stories and language, or developed out of other sound memory or something totally different? And I think, yeah, as you read those, you know, some of the little chants, it's natural to try and start putting music to them in your mind. And we know some tunes stick around for a really long time.
Thoughts?
Anyone?
I was, in my rereading this time, I was really, since I've been very influenced by Paulina Oliveros and her concept of deep listening since the first time, well, since the time that I first reread it in grad school. So all of the listening was, yes, very, very much more, had much more of an impact on me this time, and just paying attention to how much sound really does play a role in it, which I don't think I had recognized at that level, just how much. And I was just interested in hearing about the sounds that you're thinking of for the performance. And there's a recording I have of Norwegian archaeologists who tried to recreate the music from bone instruments and stone instruments that they had dug up, and trying to see how they would have been played. And that seems like exactly the kind of thing that would be useful to a performance of it. I don't know.
The only thing that I ever crossed my mind as a possible tune for a specific thing in the book is the work song that they're singing at the pit. Just from the meter of it, it seems a lot to me like that's the sort of familiar sound off military cadence, and which is I think also from older
Or
works.
like
Chain
the
gang.
old walking song.
Yeah. Yeah. Chain gang music. Yeah. Work songs, which are have a similar cadence throughout all kinds of different cultures, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of a call and response thing with a certain number of beats that's good for like some kind of very boring task.
I have a question about geography, which will display my ignorance of the geography of Britain. Ridley, true to his name, covers a lot of ground on foot in the book, and I was wondering how possible is it for those journeys to have actually been made in the 3 or 4 days that the book covers? Are those geographical places really that close to each other?
I'd really like to give a shout out here to a podcast called the Curiously Specific Book Club. I don't know. Are none of you familiar with it?
No, I'm not.
Well, they have a double episode about Ridley.
Oh,
And no, you really must check it out because, I mean, what they do, their thing, each episode they take a different book, and the point is to kind of reconstruct, what places, what journeys, actions are happening, right? And so they go to Kent and they see, okay, so we have, Mr. Clever's, rolling ground over here, and he's supposed to get there in 1 day. So how far is that actually, and is that feasible? And precisely this question of the feasibility of covering certain distances is something that they, worked out quite fastidiously. And it turned out that he would, well, as what is it? I think Good Party himself says to him, it's like more like Ridley Runner. But he would have had to do some pretty fast, would have had to leg it pretty fast to cover those distances.
yeah, and especially traveling with the blind art-ship, that I would think that would be challenging. But I'll have thank you for that, for letting us know about that. That sounds like a great resource to listen to.
Yeah, I'll write that in the chat so that it
Yeah,
doesn't get
please
forgotten.
do. Please do. Dave, any other questions from the folks that are joining us?
Yeah, we've got a couple others here. It's almost hard to decide because I know we're getting low on time, but
Yeah.
Tim Haley says it is common knowledge that early drafts were in standard English and ran to more than 500 pages. All throughout here, Russ always said he was the #1 returner to page 1 in his writing process. He always, and he did that with Ridley. But Tim continues, as the broken language was perhaps initially at least secondary to the story, was the first 1974 draft different story-wise before it was led elsewhere? I suppose this is a question for Wieland. So I don't know if you know anything about that, Wieland, or not.
Well, no, I mean, that was 4 years before I was born.
Right.
Not from direct knowledge anyway, right?
No.
Yeah.
No, I don't know.
I suppose a related question is, did Russ ever really talk to you about his writing? Did you ever get to the point where you talked to Russ about the book and how he wrote it? And did he, tell you anything interesting about it?
Yeah. I mean, he did sometimes, if one asked, say a few things about how he worked. He was very I know, proud of his kind of principle of economy. This one quote just that I remember from him is, anything that doesn't add to it takes away from it. You know, so this idea of any sort of dead wood then reduces the quality of what there is, which makes sense. But of course, like, you know, one's mileage varies in terms of what one considers unnecessary. And my father could be quite conservative there, or pragmatic. But yeah, this thing of always, I guess it has something of sculpture, maybe, that he was always kind of chipping away and always trying to get, rather than, you know, adding further details, in a way, working out what was extraneous and getting more and more to the point. So that was something that he sometimes spoke about, how he'd sort of keep returning, that he'd maybe, you know, write a whole bunch of text and then go back to the beginning and then, you know, rework it all again. And me, which is something, as a composer, I would never want to do that. It's, you know, sounds like torture, but that was how he did things.
Maybe a good last question from the audience, since we've been talking about Riddley Walker for a while. Matthew Rumble wrote this in the chat, and other people have been answering it, but it would be great to hear the panelists weigh in on it as well. He says, I was wondering what people thought was their favorite other Hoban novel. I read Kleinzeit first, and it is always my best. So maybe let's hear what other ones stand out for the other panelists.
Waiting for somebody to start.
It's tough because they I mean, I would say they're all so different. In other ways they're not. There's so many clear connections and themes, but Turtle Diary is way up there for me. It's also one of his relatively realistic works, and so it kind of, then there's this whole other category of everything else, where I don't know, I think I could say Pilgriman, but then I'd also want to pick a favorite one that's more lighthearted. So then you just keep making different categories and shifting the goalposts, I guess.
I always say, for me, it's a 7-way tie between his first 7 novels, really. I think they're all wonderful, and they're also different from each other, as you say.
And I'm well known for my love of Kleinzeit, which I find delightful and funny and profound without being too heavy about it. So
I might agree with that. Although I have a very sentimental attachment to the marzipan pig.
Yeah.
Not really a novel, but
if anyone hasn't ever seen the little animated or semi-animated short film of the marzipan pig, which I'd love to find out if it's ever been issued on disc or anything like that, but narrated by Tim Curry, it's lovely.
I think I have a DVD of it. I really do. I think it was available for a DVD. I think I've got that somewhere, so I'll see if I can dig that out.
Wieland, what's your second favorite?
You're assuming that Ridley is my
right. I am.
Yeah, it is, but actually, what's funny is that one of the things that sets Ridley apart from the others, I think, is that the protagonist is not in some way my father.
Mm.
You know, with the late novels, it's very obvious. I mean, it's not even sort of disguised. It's just him living in Fulham and, you know, going around the corner just to, you know, to visit a Klein bottle shop or whatever. But with Ridley, it's really different. I mean, he's a kid, and he was in his 50s when he wrote it. You know, as opposed to the other protagonists, which tend to be more or less, I think, I mean, I haven't worked it out with every book, but I would say that the narrators or the protagonists tend to be more or less just the sort of age that my father was when he wrote them. And they're also often just very similar, you know, often they're writers and maybe they have a German wife. I mean, the Medusa frequency, I guess, is the most obvious culprit in some ways, that he has this, you know, this author, and also with this kind of typical Jewish American sense of humor, which of course you don't get any of in Riddley, really, or only in a microscopic degree compared to, say, the Medusa frequency or Kleinzeit. I actually rather like also Fremder, which is much more of what one would call science fiction. I mean, I've always thought it was a bit of a misnomer in the case of Riddley, which may be chosen more simply because it's set far in the future.
Yeah.
Although maybe I'd have to defer to a literary scholar on what really defines science fiction.
Don't try to do that. That's such a can of worms that you will start another series of 20 books arguing about it.
Well, we've reached our hour. Do we, I think we might want to wrap up. Thank all of you for joining us for this really interesting discussion. I really want to thank Wieland and Eli and Kate for joining us. It really deepens my appreciation of the book and makes me want to go back and read it again, and look forward to the day when we can see Wieland's work being produced. So good luck with that.
Thanks, me too.
Yeah. I'd like to give special thanks to Elia Bisker, who is our Zoom manager. She's been in the background there. There she is now, making things go so smoothly. Thank you so much. Anne Halliday, our friend, recommended Elia to us, and we want to thank her. Juan Esguerra, who is our graphic designer and illustrator, and Richard Cooper, who is the webmaster of russellhoban.org. There he is. Thanks to all of you. If you haven't already, please follow Russell Hoban on Blue Sky and Facebook, and you can always find the links on russellhoban.org. Once again, if you feel like donating to help keep this and other events possible, you can do so by going to russellhoban.org and clicking on the little orange button with the coffee cup that says support me on Ko-fi. And finally, I would like to extend thanks from all of us to Dave All, who is the founder of the Feast. He's been the prime mover of the Hoban 100, and he organized this event. And I know it's a labor of love, but it's also been a lot of work. So thank you, Dave, very much for putting this all together. It's been really great.
Thank you. I'll just tack one thing on here that we have mentioned and discussed Eli's wonderful Riddley Walker annotation site, which, again, I just reread the book and it was so helpful to me. But Peter Christian also has a wonderful Riddley Walker concordance website, which is another great resource. And the link is here in the chat. So you'll find that in the chat transcript.
And again, yeah, this has been recorded and will be available later on. And we've had the closed captioning on, so hopefully there will be a transcript as well. And watch Russell, I was going to say RiddleyWalker.org. No, RussellHoban.org for the link to that in future. Thanks, everybody. Have a great, whatever the rest of the day is for you, or night, or morning, or day tomorrow.
Thanks.
Thank you, Diana.
Bye.
Ciao, friend.
Now I'm going to let the cat in. She's so mad at me.